All right, it is finally the day I've been waiting for all summer long. It's been like 6 months of prep work to get to this point. Today is primer day. It's the day after priming when I recorded this, but what I want to do before I show you guys the actual priming process is just kind of walk through some of the things that we're going to use, some of the tools we're going to use, some of the methods we're going to use, because when I actually primed this thing, everything just happened very quickly and I didn't have a chance to sit down and explain it all. My wife and I took a whole day, and starting at about 9:30, 10 o'clock, when it was finally dry enough, the sun had come up and dried off the camper, we started masking and we started prepping for paint by cleaning. And by the time we did all that, and then we got our vehicles out of the way and got set up to spray, it was about 3:30 before we actually started spraying. And then we sprayed from about 3 till 5. And then it was a mad rush to get all the masking off of it before it got dark. So it was a crazy day yesterday. So let me show you guys now what actually we're gonna be seeing sprayed on the camper. I ended up going with an epoxy primer. This is from TCP Global. It's their restoration shop. This is kind of one of their lower end lines, but I think it's one of their only epoxies. Not trying to get fancy here, but I went with the epoxy because it's called a DTM, or direct to metal. And what that means is it can go straight onto the aluminum. So aluminum is tricky. Steel, things adhere to much better, but aluminum has an oxidation layer on the surface that really prevents things from sticking to it. And so the old way of doing it was an etching primer, which uses acid to actually etch into the metal and stick to it. But the kind of newer way of doing it is this epoxy primer. So this costs a little bit more, but everything I read said this is the way to go. And the big advantage to this is that I'm not going to be painting this until next year. And this has just a hard shell that forms with the epoxy. And so that was what ultimately made the decision for me to use this over an etching primer. So this is a 1-to-1 mix of the epoxy primer, and then they have a hardener that goes along with it. And that's what actually makes it dry. And it dries pretty quick. Once it's on, it's dry to the touch in like under 10 minutes, I think it was. So those are the primer. I ended up going through just under 2 gallons. Looking back, I probably should have gone a little heavier, and it probably would have been closer to 2.5, 3 gallons. So when I plan on the actual color, that's what we're gonna plan on, is 3 gallons. But I was able to get away with 2, and it covered fine. It just isn't as smooth as maybe it could be in some spots. And then I also bought the Restoration Shop wax and grease remover. This just helps prep the surface. We wipe down the entire thing with this to get any aluminum dust off, any grease, any fingerprints, things like that. And then finally we went over it with something called a tack cloth, which is just kind of a waxy feeling cloth that gets any lint or anything like that. That was probably unnecessary because it's outside, but that's kind of how you would do it in a paint booth. So we went ahead and did it. And then finally, I bought some of the Restoration Shop urethane reducer. The only real purpose for this was for cleaning the gun. I know I'll need that later when I paint anyway, and so I can use it then, and it helped me clean the gun this time. So speaking of the gun, let's talk about what we're using for that. So this is called an HVLP gun. This is, the HVLP style is typically what's used for automotive work. HVLP stands for high volume, low pressure. And so this uses a lot of air, but not with a lot of pressure. This is gravity fed. And in addition to the gun itself, I've got a regulator mounted on here so I can measure the air pressure going in. And then I also have a disposable desiccant filter. And this gets the last little bit of moisture out of my air before it goes onto the metal. So I'll show you kind of how we dry our air in a minute here with the compressor setup. These guns are awesome. I've had these for like 10 or 11 years. These were like a knockoff. The brand's called Star. These were like a knockoff thing back when I bought it. They were very inexpensive. And I guess since then they've become a more mainstream brand, and these have gotten a bit more expensive, but it's a few $100s for a decent level HVLP gun for automotive work. And you kind of need 2 of them because you've got the primer and then you've got the base coat, clear coat. And so this has a 1.8 tip on it. I think it's 1.8 liters or something. I'm not sure, but I don't think it's millimeters. Maybe it is. I don't know. I'm no expert, but this is a 1.8 base coat clear coat gun that I have is a 1.4. And so this is just used for primer, and this is what is recommended by the primer company. So we're gonna use this gun to dial in our pressure, we're gonna use this regulator to dial in our pressure at the gun, which this only runs between 16 to 19 PSI. So very low. And let's take a look at our air compressor, and I'll show you guys kind of some considerations when you're spraying to make sure that we have nice, clean, dry air. Okay, so forgive me, the lighting is not real good here with this window behind me. This is the compressor we're using. This is a 60-gallon Craftsman compressor. And this has, well, let's look at what the motor is here. This is a 3.7 horsepower motor. So this puts out a good amount of air, but when I bought this, it specifically said that it was okay for HVLP, not continuous use. And I did a little research. My spray guns have a pretty low CFM requirement, so I decided to chance it, and thankfully it worked out. It kept up no problem. So this was a good setup for me. This is a 240 volt compressor, so I had to put in an outlet that can run that specifically. However, when you're painting, you're making a lot of air, and so compressing air makes the air hotter. As pressure goes up, heat goes up. So there are a number of considerations that I'm going to show you guys here that have to happen after the air leaves the compressor to make sure that it's ready for the spray gun. So let's take a look at the setup we've got here. All right, so there's a lot going on here, but you can see coming out of the compressor right away, we've got a valve and a hose, and this goes down to what's called an aftercooler. And so this aftercooler is just a setup of iron pipes, and it gives the air a chance to cool down. It goes through those pipes, and then at the other end of those pipes, there's a drop. And so as the air cools, it will condense moisture, which will fall down. And so this drop is where that moisture will go. When I was done spraying and I cleared this out, it had more moisture in it than the air tank did, which was really surprising to me. From there, we've got a loop that goes up to our air drying setup. Now I should mention, this aftercooler should be above the compressor. So any moisture going into the aftercooler comes back into the compressor. And then if it's above the air drying setup, it can go to that. I just don't have the room to do that. So this was the best I could do, and it seemed to be okay. So first the air goes into these filters. These are, I think 5 micron filters. They're basically to catch the bulk of the air, or excuse me, the bulk of the water in the air. Once they've made it through those, then it goes through this larger, this is an Eastwood CFS, and there's an optional desiccant filter installed in it. And so this should catch any of the really fine droplets. Finally, it goes from there to a hose and out to the gun. So all of this is meant to dry all that air. And as I look, I have the pressure turned off. You know, really these have a few drops of water in them, but really hardly anything has accumulated, and really only in the first one. So it means the aftercooler is working. It's condensing a lot of that moisture before it gets to those. But between those two, the desiccant filter in here and the disposable desiccant on the HVLP gun, we have nice, clean, dry air. All right, so I showed you kind of what we're doing. Now I'm gonna cut to yesterday's videos and show you what this process looked like, masking, cleaning, and spraying. And then after that's done, I'm gonna show you what it looks like. All right, this thing is officially masked. So now the next step is to clean. We've got some wax and grease remover. We're gonna go over the whole thing with this and just try to get any sanding dust, any fingerprint grease, anything like that off before we prime. All right, we've got this whole thing masked, cleaned. And we used a tack cloth to get the surface nice and lint free. We just mixed up our first batch of the epoxy primer. I'm gonna get my respirator on here and we're gonna get going with 2 coats. Here she is. You'll notice I took the masking paper off of one window. I did that because I had an issue because I didn't caulk in the seams here. The tape was sticking to the butyl tape. I was originally going to spray the primer on the butyl tape until I read in the primer instructions not to put it over any flexible primer. And so my concern is that this primer dries so hard that it might not flex the way I need it to over the caulk. Or over the tape rather. So I'm gonna wait and I'm gonna caulk this and then either paint over the caulk or maybe even paint and then caulk. But that tape was sticking to that butyl tape. And so I was concerned about it coming off, but it came off with a little bit of pulling the tape. I was able to kind of smush it back. But everything looks really good. We got up onto the roof, we got down into the bottom. So everything is protected. Awesome to see the fenders same color now, so it doesn't look nearly as nice as it did when it was silver and gold, but it's protected and we'll be able to keep it that way until it's time to get paint on it next year. All right, so yesterday went awesome. All of the paint is on, all of the masking paper is off, and this has just formed such a nice hard coating on here. If I take my fingernail and I try to scratch it, it just will not come off, which is great. That means that we prepped right, we cleaned right, and we've got the right product on here. So really happy about this. I now know this aluminum is protected all winter long, and I'm really happy with how it went. Laura mixed paint for me while I sprayed, which was great. She had enough time to take a minute or two break, mix up a batch, and then I would come in, put it in the gun and go back out and spray. We did it in 2 coats, 2 medium coats, just to make sure we didn't have any runs. And again, I could have gone thicker. There's some texture in some spots that feels a little dry, but ultimately really happy. As far as things that I might do different, you can see kind of right here, this line that goes up and down. There's actually kind of 2. There's another one back here. That's where I started and stopped. And so the paint was dry by the time I was spraying over it, which is fine for primer. There's not a stop and start mark. It's just a little thicker there. When it comes to actually spraying paint, I may need to do a full horizontal run down the trailer and just have ladders set up to go back and forth the full run to prevent that. So I'm going to talk to an auto body friend and just kind of consult online and try to figure out the best course of action there. Because we're not in the spray booth, I really have very little control over the dry times. So it's pretty apparent that there's marks there. The other thing that happened that I would do differently if I had a chance, you can see underneath here, this butyl tape all got pulled out by the tape. And so when I pulled the masking off, it grabbed onto the butyl tape and it just stretched the edge of it out, which is really a bummer because I spent a lot of time to get that nice and smooth. But it is what it is. We'll go back on a cool day, trim it, and then run a bead of caulk all down here and get this sealed up. Still waterproof. It didn't affect the butyl tape, but I know that it needs to be cleaned up, and I know that it needs caulk so that it's not going to do that next time around. So all in all, it was a super successful day yesterday. Really happy with how this turned out. Really happy with just all the planning that went into it and how it really resulted in a good finished product. So at this point, I'm going to start focusing on getting some of these openings closed up. I'm working on getting the bunk windows stripped and gaskets replaced so that they can go in. And then maybe like the tail lights and a few other openings just to really get it closed up for winter. And then we're going to move into demo and kind of take it from there. There's going to be some planning involved once the demo's done to make sure we know where everything's going. And we're just going to keep chipping away at it. But I'm really encouraged. This was the biggest part of this whole project, was stripping and getting this primed. And so now I can break it up into little chunks, which makes it feel a lot more doable. And hopefully before too long, this thing will be done. Thanks for following along. We'll have some more videos coming up soon. And make sure you subscribe to our channel so you can see when the new videos come out.